Yes, hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of... What did we decide this was? This is Hard Labor and Money Splashes, a Rolling Stones podcast.
Straight from the shoulder, a Rolling Stones podcast is also a contender.
Yeah, we'll have decided by the time this airs, I think.
Right, we'll find a name.
We're Craig and John. We're your hosts. We're taking you through we've created this podcast to talk about the world's greatest rock and roll band. And if you don't know who they are, I'm puzzled to why you're probably listening to this podcast.
But it's great, because this is where you can find out.
Yes, you should already know this, but if you don't, you're going to find out. We were very surprised to find out that there weren't a lot of Rolling Stones podcasts. I thought there would be hundreds.
Why isn't every Stone podcasting like every day? I don't know.
We found one. We found many podcasts that were classic rock podcasts and different music podcasts and things. But we didn't find any that were Rolling Stone specific. And more importantly, I think, than that is we didn't find any that. Well, first I didn't find any. But second, a lot of times we don't find Rolling Stones documentaries and things that cover the topics that we want to cover, that we want covered. For a lot of people, the Rolling Stones only exist in a vacuum that ends, I'm going to be generous and say 1981.
Well, it ends when they got out of college.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And then they forgot that, all this greatness was happening after.
I think to a lot of people it's a 60s, maybe a 70s band, and I'll be generous and say 1981 when Start Me Up comes out. To that point, the Stones are still around as of this recording.
Still having hits.
It just had a number one hit with Living in a Ghost Town. So there's all this great stuff that happens from 82 to 2020. There's also a lot of topics and background that happens that I think that we both think don't get enough attention. We'll certainly get into those.
Now, I would say that as someone who studies this, by the time you've read 5 books on the Rolling Stones, you find out that the books are quoting each other.
Yeah.
And so one person is kind of setting a story that might not actually be the real story, and that's something we want to go deep into on this podcast. So if you're a newbie, this is a great place. You'll learn all the good stuff. If you're deeper into the pudding like we are, I think you'll still learn some things.
Yes.
And learning is fundamental.
Fun and fundamental. And we decided to start with this particular era and this particular album, the 1983 album Undercover. One of the reasons being that this is, I think, your favorite Rolling Stones album.
It is my favorite album.
Yeah, you've said this a long time. You're not someone who later, I think, discovered this. Like, this has been your favorite Rolling Stones album for a long time.
Yes. And if you ask me why, I would just say, because it just kicks ass all over everything.
Right.
It's just to sum up.
But we find that this is often an overlooked album in the overall canon. I think on a broader scale, even by Rolling Stones fans, self-professed Rolling Stones fans sometimes. They don't talk too much about this one. It's at a really interesting point in the band's history.
In history, as we'll see, in history period.
Yeah, we did a lot of research on this, and we find especially if you're an international, if you're outside of the United States, I should say, there's a lot of fans of this album and a lot of cultural significance that we didn't really know at the time.
I could add another thing in this one. This is part of the very, very criminally underappreciated Chris Kimsey era. If you track the Stones by producer, this is certainly some of the greatest songs, some of the greatest sounds and everything, and yet it's not usually the thing that people pick out as, oh, that's my favorite. But
so one of the things we wanted to do is go down these avenues and look at these things in Rolling Stones history that don't get as much attention. And we thought this would be a great way to start what we would hope would be the first season of this podcast. Where I'd want to start, I think, is to talk a little bit about where the band is at the point of this album, or maybe even back it up a little bit before that to set a little overall context. If you're like I said, if you're something of a fan, you know this. Maybe if you're a newbie, you don't know as much of this. This album comes out in 1983. I would say that this is probably, the Stones are probably at their zenith in pop culture. I don't want to say pop culture significance, because they've been significant since the 60s, but they'd had what many refer to as a comeback in 1978 when they did Some Girls. So, the band starts in the 60s, they're huge. They're at the forefront of the British invasion. Everybody knows that story. We get into the 70s. They're still making hits. They're still having these huge concert tours. The singles aren't charting as high, perhaps, as in the United States. Some of the albums, I think, are still solid sellers, but they're not getting the kind of attention. There's a lot of, talk in the quote-unquote rock critic circles that the band might be fading.
The live tours are setting records.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, if you're the Rolling Stones, you have the record because you just beat your previous record, which just beat your record for the tour before that. Largely, the greatest show anyone's ever seen, the biggest tour everyone's ever seen. So they're still like a living, breathing 50% rock, 50% roll machine, and they're getting over with everyone who goes to see them. Someone else is saying like, they're not as good as Journey or the Eagles or something. And then something amazing happens after Joe Strummer from The Clash embarrasses himself, saying no Stones or Who in 1977. Suddenly,
then the supposed comeback, if you will, of Some Girls, which is a multi-platinum success. Some Girls is the songs from Some Girls that were hits in the United States, which would be Miss You, Shattered, Beast of Burden, are the songs. These are some of the songs that I, as a child, these are the first songs I remember that weren't like nursery rhymes or something. Like they were on the radio everywhere. Miss You was a huge hit. We'll talk more about Some Girls at another time, but this kind of brought the band. It was a number one album. Miss You was a number one single. Beast of Burden charted in the top 10. I think Shattered is a top 20 maybe. They're on Saturday Night Live, which at the time was a pretty hip show to be, we could argue.
People.
Right. We'd argue now that it's past its prime, but at the time, if you were hosting on Saturday Night Live, that meant you were... They weren't letting has-beens host Saturday Night.
Yeah, you were the coolest. You were on the edge.
It was a cool thing to host. The tour that they do for that is a very successful money-making tour. It's a little bit of a mixed bag because they play some clubs and some stadiums and things. It starts this sort of Renaissance period, which continues into 1980 with Emotional Rescue, the album Emotional Rescue. There's no tour for that. And then in 1981, they released Tattoo You, and they set, at the time, the 1981 tour to support that. As we said, the tours keep breaking records. The 81 tour breaks all the records their own records that they've shattered.
So suddenly by 1981, they're number one again. They're the biggest band in the world.
They carry that tour into 1982 and through Europe.
And I should point out now, early, this is a theme you're going to see recurring up until the present day. People are like, wow, they're just... Come on, they're over now. And then suddenly they come back, they break their own record, they have the greatest tour or the most attended tour or something like that, and they're back on top, like they are right now.
And so that brings us up to date here. So they've finished the largest tour ever. They've wrapped it up in 1982. Now they're going to go back into the studio and make their next album, which is technically not their first album of the 80s, but if you read the literature and you read the interviews and we've read them, the 1980 Emotional Rescue, according to Mick Jagger, was a lot of leftovers from Some Girls. There might have been some songs recorded at the time, but a lot of the ideas had started probably in the 70s. Tattoo You, which comes out in 1981, is blatantly a compilation of songs that had been started in the 70s. They needed something pretty quick to do on tour, so we'll talk about that another time. But this album that they're going to do here, which turns into the Undercover album,
it's all fresh.
It's all fresh. This is all fresh material. They go into the studio in 1982 to start to record.
Now, this gets to be a pattern in the Kimsey era, where they have a monster hit album, and then they're like, well, we proved it. We're this great, commercial entity. Now let's do something interesting. And they will always follow up these hits with a more experimental album. So from Some Girls to Emotional Rescue, and then from
Tattoo You
to Undercover, suddenly this is the taking chances.
So this is here's an interesting kind of point to discuss. So feeling about this, especially later reading back on it, is that Mick Jagger wanted to go more experimental. He wants to have fresh sounds. He doesn't want to do a rehash of things they've done before. They don't want to do Some Girls again because they've already done it. He definitely doesn't want to go back to like a 60s, early 70s sound. He's trying to incorporate a lot of the styles of the time, a lot of dance music. There's some reggae that ends up on there. There's a little bit of rap, very early rap.
We'll talk about that when the time comes.
Keith Richards, on the other hand, Keith Richards is coming out of his long period of the 70s of his heroin addiction and trying to be more involved in the song writing, song production, the direction of the band. He doesn't necessarily want to go these routes.
He wants to make great rock and roll.
Yeah.
And he thinks that all of these other things, and I think time has told on this, really. A lot of things that were trendy in 1983 aren't with us anymore. In fact, when we talk about this era a little more, a lot of things that were supposed to be the new thing and we're going to make the Stones too old-fashioned to live, the Stones are still here and those things are clown shoes today. So yeah, Keith gets it. If you look at, in my view, I think of Keith as like the engine, like the heart of the Stones. He's like, now it's time to get rocking, and not, let's not forget rolling. And Mick is like, listen, these are the times and we want to be modern. We want to be au courant, not just a throwback. Now, one of the things that I would say that makes this my favorite Stones album is right here. This is mature music they come out in the sense of mastery of their art, in the way that, like, maybe the first two Beethoven symphonies are like, well, it's very Bach-y. He's not really Beethoven until like maybe the third. And this is happening here where like the Stones are suddenly like, how did they get so good? Well, of course, because they've been doing it, getting better every year, But at this point, like, no one had ever heard anything like this album up to this point. And a phrase Keith Richards would use a lot is like, I wanted to get together with Mick and see if we could grow this thing up, if we could make real rock and roll for ourselves. And then Mick was kind of like, well, let's see what else is happening. There's a whole world of music out there that's not just our, little group. And this is a tension that's going to inform this whole album.
I think, too, this is probably where a few things start to happen. This is where the method of recording these songs starts to change a little bit, where in the past, in the 60s, they would do these things very quickly and they were just all living together and on top of each other. In the 70s, it starts to get spread out. People are living in different places. They have to fly in from all over the world. But when they do, they have these very long jam sessions. And maybe at the end of 10 hours, something comes out of that. And maybe it doesn't. I think at this point, Mick Jagger is starting to say, this is a lot of time spent on this. I want to come in with more ideas, at least somewhat formed. I don't want to necessarily spend 10 hours chasing a riff or an idea that might not be there. Some of the songs on the album, I think he definitely came in with an idea of what he wanted to do, and maybe, this is conjecture here, but maybe, this is where he starts to come in and say, this is what I think this should be, you guys play on it. His solo work is we're going to talk about his solo work later, but this is the era, too, where Mick Jagger starts to get these ideas. People have been putting this idea in his head that maybe he can be a solo star on the level of like a Michael Jackson.
Well, this is the very thing. Bizarrely, the moguls of the music industry back then, before they were just these corporate stooges and boards they are today, didn't grasp the singular talent of Michael Jackson. What they saw was, here's a guy who left his group, the Jackson 5, behind, and now he's bigger than ever. Mm-hmm. That's what they thought. Like, oh, well, there's lots of guys who could leave their group behind and go solo, and maybe they'd be as big as Michael Jackson. They literally thought that's all it took. In some cases, when you see like Phil Collins without Genesis, the case could be made. He probably raked in more hits like that. But by and large, this was, faulty reasoning, as we'll see.
Everybody was chasing that, I think, at that point. And I don't have this down. I don't know if you do, but they do. Did they sign their record deal before they do Undercover or after?
So Undercover is the last studio album that they owe Atlantic.
Okay.
Before the next deal, which is again like a record-setting, record-setting figure for its time. I believe they deliver like a greatest hits package to Atlantic after this.
I think it's the Rewind. Yeah, that would make sense because that does contain songs from this album, and we'll talk about that later too.
And they totally did not phone in their last Atlantic. They're like, let's give it our all. And see what we can come up with.
So after this, they're going to definitely go down this other direction where they sign a deal, which is the biggest deal at the time for any band, with Columbia. I think is I don't remember exactly, but part of that deal includes a Mick Jagger solo, I think 2 solo albums. And that will cause a lot of trouble down the line. I don't know how much of that was already being hinted at or discussed or debated or argued between these guys at that point. But
so a theme of Undercover, of this session, is that a lot of the tension and trouble that's happening that we usually associate with the next album is already starting to happen here. This is the beginning of the Brenda era, where people start calling Mick Brenda behind his back. And a lot of the fault lines that will later erupt into these solo albums from Keith and Mick, and and Woody, and Charlie. But a lot of it is actually it's happening here, and we all become aware of it, in time for Dirty Work. But everything is not rosy in the Stones. Should we talk about the state of the Stones in 1983 or 82 about now? Like what's going on with the Stones right now?
They wrapped up the European leg of the Tattoo tour by early 82. So by the end of 82, they're in the studio recording off and on over the next few months, because the album comes out in November of 83. This is still the Paris era, if I remember right. Or some of it's probably done in New York.
Yeah, they fly back and forth for the Undercover sessions.
Yeah.
This is the last album with Stu.
Yeah, and I don't remember how much he's really on it.
He's piano on a couple tracks. He does some off percussion on some other things. But of course, his presence, his conscience, his willing to abuse and humiliate his bandmates is keeping things real for them in a special way.
They don't. I think the sessions start with Mick and Keith trying to recreate the old magic of just the two of them in a room. I know that Keith has said one of the songs we'll talk about later is the only song that Keith sings on the album, which is "Wanna Hold You," that they did together. I think they did it in Paris with Mick playing drums.
Wow.
Yeah, so Charlie not around for that.
Well, this is where Charlie has his little period where he goes off the rails.
Yeah.
Where he gets very deep into drugs and alcohol, and as he'll say later, it's like, well, all I can tell you is that by 1983 I turned into a different person, and that would last so many years, and then he would snap out of it. So
the feeling behind, by the time they get to the next album, Dirty Work, is that, Jagger said before, like, well, nobody was in good shape at that point in the band. Probably at this point, people are starting to not be. I mean, if they were ever in good shape. They're not.
That's a relative thing, compared to Exile on Main Street. Keith is in the best shape he's ever been, right? Yeah. But Ronnie and now Charlie, who usually you can count on, is in rough shape. Bill is okay. He's still knocking it out. The world's most underrated bassist.
Yeah, we need an episode just on Bill Wyman. We need probably a season just on Bill Wyman himself. I think he plays synthesizer on a couple of these tracks. And there's always some debate, too, because, I'd imagine there's somebody whose job it is to record all these details of who plays on what. And we've found in our research that people who document this, sometimes the sources don't necessarily agree. Like, sometimes they'll say, oh, this guy played this track on this guitar, and then we find another source that says, no, he didn't. It was this person on this guitar. Some of them will never get to the bottom, hopefully.
In 2020, the standards for credits are so much better than they've ever been in all of music history. A lot of times you'll read a book, and later when you track it down, it's like, oh, because this other guy told me that's what happened because he said he was there. And maybe that was even true.
Recording sessions continue on through 83 because there's a target date that they make of November 1983 as the release date. As we talk about the songs, I guess we can say this first, in that some of these, it comes out later that some of these songs Keith is not a fan of. And some of this is hearsay, and some of this is his quotes that I've found later.
The perception that Keith is just not happy.
Yeah.
Right.
There's two...
As he would put it later, he's later, now that he's cleaning up his act, and perhaps the Stones have this sort of redemption where they've come back on top of the heap again, and now they're really going to go for it with this new album. And he's like, listen, I'm here now. I can take the weight off. I've been a liability for all these years, and now I can be helping with all these things like we used to. And people are kind of like, well, we kind of got a system down without that now, or maybe like, I've been in charge of all these things. Are you trying to take the power away or that? And I think one of his great sayings is like, if one person perceives there's a power struggle, then there is.
Yeah.
And this is where it starts, and it just keeps going.
It makes me wonder. He had something in mind, like you had said. He wanted to create the greatest rock and roll that they could possibly do and now they're all coming up on 40 at this point, which sounds funny now, but at the
knowing
time,
what we now know, that they'd be rocking, the whole world in their 70s.
To pushing 80. But it sounds funny to say now, but at the time, that was pretty unheard of for rock stars to still be going at it. I mean, Elvis died, he was 42. There was Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and those guys were still going strong. But to have a band maintain and stay at that level of fame and success into your 40s, it was like uncharted territory. Nobody had really done it yet. Now everybody does it.
Well, this is something that has to be, I think, brought up too here at this point in time. All of the stuff that was supposed to replace the Stones has come and gone.
Yeah.
The Sex Pistols and the New York Dolls. Oh, wait, they didn't make it, did they? All these new things. That terrible, like, James Taylor, Eagles folk rock. Those guys are all washed up now. There's definitely new and exciting things happening in the world of music, but the Stones are amazingly still here in their prime, as it turns out.
Yeah, and Keith pushes back on Mick's bringing in dance grooves and South American rhythms and rap and
a lot of Caribbean disco is coming in.
Keith is pushing back on that. He doesn't seem to like it. He doesn't want to participate. According to Ron Wood and in other sources, there's certain songs that he says, well, Keith just wouldn't. I was involved in it because Keith wouldn't get involved in it. And we'll talk about one or two of those examples here in a minute. But Mick's bringing these ideas in, and Keith is just. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know. But the legend is he's just like, I can't. I don't know what this is. I don't like it. But, I mean, he was open to these things in the past, right? Like, before they'd always brought in, I mean, if you go back to just from the beginning, like, they were this blues band in the beginning, and it became kind of a pop band. Then they're bringing in, the psychedelic sounds of the mid to late 60s. They're bringing in the horn section later. They're bringing in funk, disco, reggae. Billy Preston comes in for a while in the 70s. There's a little bit of a nod to punk on Some Girls. I mean, maybe he wasn't in on it then. Maybe he wasn't. He definitely was in the '60s, but at this point in the '80s, he's cleaned up and he's not as receptive to these ideas.
I feel that this is not unjustified. If you've seen a lot of stuff come and go as a fad or a trend, and the thing you're good at is still going strong.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to take a lot of things seriously and wonder, like, is this really going to be here? Is this going to go away? Lots of people in the 80s, Mick, is famous for saying this, like, will Madonna just go away?
Right.
Like, well, it's going to be a long time before that happens.
I wonder if Keith always had a song or two on, maybe since the late 60s on each album, and contrary to his reputation as this hard rock guy, most of the songs that he does on the Stones albums, there's some exceptions, but a lot of them are ballads and slow pieces. The 80s and 90s, as he goes, more and more on each album, he does mostly these slower songs, and I wonder if that's kind of what he had in mind at this point, where he's like, I want to grow this up and be this rock and roll band.
Well, I think there's a different thing happening, too, because at this point, metal is becoming a different entity.
True.
Than it was in the Sabbath. It's becoming its own niche at your local record shop. And at that point, the role becomes of primary importance, because that's what all those guys don't have. Mm-hmm. So I think this is where he starts to realize, like, the role is everything, and we just put some rock in there too. But rock without the role is a mistake.
It never ends well. We've seen it.
It turns into Quiet Riot, who, again, where are they today? 1983, this is their crowning moment, as we'll see. But
they're also coming up on, and we'll talk about this later when we get to the video portions of this. They'd always done videos since the 60s, and Mick said in one of the documentaries, like, we'd always done this for every record, because people want to see you playing the song, too, in this medium. I think this is the first... MTV has broken by the time this comes out. I mean, it's going to get bigger and bigger, but it's definitely a factor
we're getting to a point where video is starting to become as important as radio.
And I think before this, they did videos, but a lot of times it was them miming to a song in a dark auditorium or something
full of bubbles.
Yeah, I mean they were fun videos, but usually it's just them pretending to play in a studio, a dark studio, and it's filmed on videotape, not film. Usually, they're all. I love them all. They're all fun videos, but this is the first time that they actually put some money into video production. I think Michael Jackson had probably. He wasn't the first guy, but he was one of the first guys to really get like an actual film director, a movie director, and put big budgets into his. And
videos. That's something Mick would do with this album with Julian Temple.
Yeah, who they recruit to do. I think. Let's see, they do 3 or 4 different videos. At least 3 videos for this.
She was hot, Undercover,
and Too Much Blood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which comes into play a little bit. I mean, we'll take a side journey into the video world of this. But
just for a moment, we talked about like what's going on with the Stones. We should talk about what's going on with the world. Strange things are happening, man. For a band from the '60s, flower power is long gone. All of these boomers, they're selling out and turning into what was called yuppies. They're about to go so conservative that they're going to elect Ronald Reagan in 1984 by the biggest landslide in history. All this peace and love and protesting the war and all of that's not where they're coming from anymore. It's if we have enough money and can exercise enough, you'll live forever, which of course, as we know now, is not true. But that was the idea. People are very greedy. America, it's just gone through a huge recession in 1982. The Cold War is in full effect, and a lot of people are really resenting this idea. Like, there's these 2 countries, and if they go to war, we're all going to die from some nuclear exchange or something, and that's making everybody kind of hostile towards the United States and the Soviet Union. That's the Earth. But 1983 turns out to be what we call a nodal point in music history. So much stuff is happening in this one tiny crossroads that it's mind-boggling, and we could only give you the broadest strokes. But let me tell you something. It's mythological what you hear in some places where someone will tell you, like, so 1983 is the year that New Wave stopped and rock came in. And suddenly bands like Van Halen would be on top. And then metal groups would start growing. Motley Crue and all of that would come forward. All going up to Guns N' Roses, which would be like the apex of American rock, after which we never seriously rocked again. It turns out this is not actually the case. Regardless of what you hear elsewhere, let me tell you about the era where the Stones are going to unleash their most angry and powerful album to date. The second British invasion is happening, and in 1983 is the year it goes into full effect. By July of 1983, 20 of the top 40 singles are going to be British. That's more than the record from 1965, which we think of as the British invasion. And that's going to happen again, like in 1986. So the new wave artists, these new British artists, they're on a roll. People like Duran Duran are starting to come in strong. Boy George is going to come out and join the A-Team, in a year or something. So it's happening. So that's one thing that's happening. The other titanic thing that happens, of course, in 1983 is Michael Jackson releases Thriller. And at 4 different times in 1983, Thriller will become the #1 album. It'll be #1 for 20 weeks, and then it'll drop out of the #1 spot, and then come back, and come back, and come back. So it's something to keep in mind, as we're saying, like, well, how come, Undercover wasn't the #1 album? Like, well, Thriller took up half the year for all #1s.
Right. There were a lot of people who weren't #1 because of Thriller.
Yeah, it was kind of rough. Something else to think about, like, these are the top 10 singles of 1983, and if you really want to do some experimenting, listen to those, and then put on Undercover. And you see what we mean when we say this is an experimental album. And it's got a lot of power. Some of it's fun, some of it's dark. But it's a lot different than these. So the #1 single of 1983 turns out to be Every Breath You Take by The Police. Listen, when we think of 80s music, you usually think of something a little edgier, like the Robert Smith from The Cure or something like that, or something by Bowie or whatever. But let me tell you from someone who was there, all of that music is the song that was played in between Jump by Van Halen, which is going to come out in December of 1983, and Every Breath You Take by The Police. 2 out of 3 80s songs were those 2 songs. Everything else 80s was in that little gap in between. The #2 song is Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. Number 3 will be Flashdance by Irene Cara. Bizarrely, number 4 will be Down Under by Men at Work. Now, Australia is getting into the
they had their one shot at the title.
Yes, unbelievably beating out Beat It by Michael Jackson. You never think Men at Work ranked on Michael ever on their best day, but it turns out on their best day they did slightly. Next comes Total Eclipse of the Heart by Bonnie Tyler, which if you've ever done karaoke, you've heard enough.
You haven't escaped that song since the 80s.
Then we have Man-Eater by Hall & Oates, and maybe the less said about that, the better. Baby Come to Me by Patty Austin and James Ingram. Then Maniac by Michael Cimbello, also off the Flashdance soundtrack. Flashdance was big. And then Sweet Dreams Are Made of This by Eurythmics.
Now, when I think of to me, that's an 80s song. Like, some of these other ones you've mentioned, like Van Halen, that came out in that time and that, but I for whatever, I know it's an 80s song, but if I had to describe and say, like, well, these are kind of 80s songs, I think I would pick Eurythmics over a Van Halen song. Just the production and the...
And a day doesn't go by in radio that Sweet Dreams isn't on somewhere, on some station in your town right now. And again, this is not what people have you believe. Like, a lot of this music is just coming into its own. Certainly to David Lee Roth, 1984, and that is a huge year for him and Van Halen. But that doesn't mean that these British acts are washed up. They're going to strike for the next 4 or 5 years. So that's happening. So number 1 albums, you have things like the Flashdance soundtrack, Synchronicity by the Police, Thriller by Michael Jackson, Men at Work's Business. This is not in any particular order. Mental Health by Quiet Riot at one point in 1983 becomes the number 1 song. And as we see, rock with no roll has no staying power. I think that's the lesson we can learn.
I think it's interesting that some of those you called out, this is still when, and it's probably a record label thing, like, that had come about maybe in the 70s where they were banking on, we can get an album that's got 5 or 6 hit singles and just milk this. You saw like the Eagles and maybe Fleetwood Mac were probably the ones who really ran with that in the late 70s and had a lot of success with it. And then Michael Jackson, of course, runs with it.
And then just the next year in 84, Prince will show everyone how to do that with Purple Rain.
And then the other thing that I thought was interesting about that list was when we talk about pulling in these influences and Keith saying, well, you're just following trends, man. But I don't hear a lot of that on this album.
Hip-hop is not the huge thing yet.
Not to that level, no. I mean, it's still probably, I mean, we're saying that, but I mean, so in like maybe New York and places like that, it was probably getting there. There was an underground swell, but it wasn't on the radio.
Yeah, even as late as 1985, if you watch Run DMC at Live Aid, a lot of the audience is just kind of like puzzled. Like, what is this?
Rap
is it going away soon?
Yeah, rap was treated as a joke really until, I mean, on mainstream radio. If you were Run DMC or maybe, and they had to get over with Aerosmith's help.
Sure.
And then you had things like the Fresh Prince, Young MC. Well, that's later on.
By 1983, the Beastie Boys haven't even happened yet.
Yeah.
It's actually, you kind of have to be a more worldly person like Mick Jagger to be picking up on it, much less doing it.
The most icily, I'd say, cynical Stones album yet, or as a piece of devastating social commentary. Would you agree with either of those views or both?
Well, I always say it was uncaring. It's supposed to be, I mean, not all of it is. There's a few songs, that stick out, like particularly Undercover and Somebody Too Much Blood or something, which are like not about girls and cars, which a lot of rock and roll songs are. I think that it's some social commentary, more perhaps than normal with us.
Probably not since certainly Beggar's Banquet, I think.
Yeah, well, there's been some. But, yeah, this is pretty... I mean, when you listen to it, I guess it's hard for me, but when you listen to it, people say, oh, wow, that's strong or slightly different. So I'm glad, that it's a bit different, that you get different angles on lyrics and don't just stick to the same subjects all the time.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Hard Labor and Money Splashes, the podcast dedicated to the world's greatest rock and roll band, the Rolling Stones. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Email us at hardlabormoneysplashes@gmail.com.